throughout these lectures, we're going to be looking at results, the bulk of which have been published in academic journals. So if something comes up where you need to prove to somebody that something exists or something is true, you don't want to be in a position where all you can do is say, well, there's this slide set that, or, there's this YouTube lecture. You actually want to be able to cite the academic research document. And so I'm going to give references to those documents. And in fact, because this is we're looking at this as a graduate course, we're actually going to be diving into some of those peer-reviewed journal articles a little bit throughout these lectures. So a series of these results are now going to come from this article, The New Statistics of Estate Planning, Lifetime and Postmortem Wills, Trusts, and Charitable Planning, and this was published in the Estate Planning and Community Property Law Journal. But I'm going to be showing you some more graphical representations of what's taking place here, but you can look up this article whenever you want to see the actual published underlying results. So again, the first question we were interested in answering is, who is interested in making charitable legacy gifts? In other words, who is likely to have a gift in their estate plan? And again, just to remind you, to answer this question of who is likely to have a gift in their estate plan, that's actually a two-part question. Because first we have to answer the question, who has estate planning documents? Because if they don't have estate planning documents, no matter how charitable they are, no matter how much they love charitable causes, they're not going to have a gift in their estate plans because they have no estate planning documents, right? So the first part of the question is, who has documents? And the second part of the question is, okay, among those who have documents, who's going to actually include charity in those documents? Okay, so understand that it is a two-part question, which means we have to look at both parts, in some cases separately. So let me give you a bit of a warning. Some of these results are not going to be particularly pretty. Now, the reason I say this is I do, from time to time, speak at different conferences. In particular, I'll speak at conferences for nonprofit organizations and for fundraisers. And frankly, fundraisers are used to hearing from people who want them to like them. They're most likely to hear from people who are consultants, who want them to hire them, and so they're going to say what it is that they want to hear. Well, because I'm not a consultant, I'm just a professor, I'm just going to give you the results the way that they are. And some of these are not that pretty, okay? Some of these results are not going to make your life easier if you're a fundraiser. Some of these results aren't going to make you that particularly happy, even if you're, for example, an estate planner. So just a bit of a warning here. This isn't all happy talk. We're going to get to some fairly disturbing results, and that's the nature of looking at some of these things. So let's jump in first to some trends. Now, we can look at trends because the Health and Retirement Study has been conducted every 2 years technically since 1992. It's been nationally representative of the 50 and above population since 1998. There are some particular age segments that go back all the way to 1992 or 1993, but the entire 50-plus population goes back to 1998. And so we can actually see what's taking place from year after year after year, because we have this nationally representative study that allows us to track these things. So the very first thing we want to look at is what's happening with the tendency for people to have will or trust documents. And so we're going back to 1998. Now notice in all of these statistics, you'll see this a lot, that we're looking at the 55 and above population with the will or trust. Now why 55 and above? Well, the issue is that even though in 1998, the Health and Retirement Study was representative of the 50 and above population, the issue is that, then the reason we go to 55 and above is that in 1998, it was representative of 50 and above. In 2000, it was representative of 52 and above because it's the same group. In 2002, it's representative of age 54 and above. And then in 2004, they add in the new younger group, so it's once again representative of the 50 and above population. So if we don't want to get our results bouncing because of the changing minimum age, we have to pick a minimum age that is age 54 or older. So I could have picked age 54 plus population, but that sounds weird. So I just picked the age 55 and above population. And so the reason that's helpful is that the youngest age is always younger than age 55. So here, the youngest age is 50. Here it's 52, here it's 54, here it's 50 again, here it's 52, here it's 54, but it won't affect our results because we're only looking at the 55 and above population. So that's just a little note as to why you'll keep seeing this 55 plus, but occasionally I'll reference that the HRS is representative of the 50 and above population. Technically, it's only representative of the 50 and above population every fourth time the survey is given. So maybe more technicality than you wanted there, but just wanted to give you that sense of what was taking place. So what is taking place? Well, look, you don't have to have a PhD in statistics to see what's taking place with these trend lines. We're seeing dropping, continuing to drop. Now, let me mention one thing. Right now, we have our preliminary 2016 results. Those are not finalized yet, so I'm just giving you projected numbers here. Also, on some of the later slides that I'm going to show you, you will see results that maybe only come up to 2014 or occasionally 2012, or if we're looking at published academic research, some of that research is a bit older, so it might come up to an earlier year. Just know that if you see a trend line, just assume that trend line has continued, because as I've looked at this data, these trend lines haven't changed, and so even if I'm showing you something that's only up to 2012 or 2014, in general things are still going. There's been no big changes. Things are still going the same direction. It may be that I just have officially done the estimations for the national population only for certain years. So anyway, what we see here is obviously dropping, and now we're looking at a point where essentially I would estimate that by this point, if we go to current day, fewer than half of the 55 and above population has will or trust documents. So that leads to the question of okay, what's going on? Why do we see this continuation of dropping the share of people who have will or trust documents? Well, let me share with you a little bit of information that I think might be useful, might be instructive to provide at least part of that explanation. So to understand this, we go back to 1995. Actually, we could go back before that, but we'll just go back to 1995 for some symmetry purposes. Back in 1995, this was the number of states that allowed transfer on death designations. That is what we might call a transfer on death deed. What's the big deal about a transfer on death deed? Here's the big deal about a transfer on death deed. It is the house that always required people to have a will document. Why is that? Well, because your bank account, your stock market account, you can put transfer on death designations on that. Your IRA account obviously has beneficiary designation on that. Life insurance, the same way. 401k, the same way. But it was, and your household items, the things around the house, they don't have a legal title, so you don't actually have to go through the court process to get any legal title change for those. So the issue was always the house. Got the house. If it's owned solely in the name of a decedent, you got to go through the court process to get that title changed. Well, now that became different when a state allowed a transfer on death designation for real estate. Because if a state allows you to put a TOD on your real estate, which essentially works just like TOD on a bank account, it means that real estate is transferred automatically at death. All you have to do is record the certificate of death in the chain of title in the recorder of deeds office. Okay, don't have to go through court. No court process. No reason to have a will because you can actually TOD everything. Now, okay, so look, I understand that I'm showing you here what is taking place in one state in 1995. You're unlikely to be in the state of Missouri, so why would you care about what the law was in Missouri in 1995. Now, I will tell you, I personally cared a lot about it, but that was because I graduated from the University of Missouri School of Law, and I was practicing in Missouri at the time, doing estate planning law practice. But the reason that we care about this is, now let's bump forward 5 more years. 5 years later, in the year 2000, we get a little bit of contagion taking place here, right? So this has spread from Missouri to Kansas, and for some reason it hopped over a couple of states to get to Ohio. Then in 2005, look what's starting to happen. This is, sort of like one of those maps where you see the disease contagion spreading across the country, right? So now we've spread from Kansas to Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada, and Wisconsin has picked it up as well. If we come up to modern day, almost everything west of the Mississippi, including Alaska and Hawaii now, allows transfer on death deeds, transfer on death designations. And in the east, we're getting more and more states allowing that, including District of Columbia, Virginia, West Virginia, Indiana, and so forth. So it is, now look, I do not have definitive proof that this change in what's called non-probate transfers, also referred to as the non-probate transfers revolution, that this is what's causing this, okay? Because in our survey, we only have information about what is happening in the will or trust documents. We don't actually have information about what people are doing with TOD designations on their wills, on their bank accounts or real estate, other things like that. But what I can say is that this non-probate transfers revolution, going boom, 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 was taking place at the same time that this was going fall, 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 fall. So there is very likely a connection here because, frankly, if you've TOD'd all of your stuff, unless you got minor kids, in which case you want to name who the guardian would be, that will document's not going to control anything. If you put TODs on all of your assets, then will document, why would you have a will, right? It's not going to control any assets anyway. A lot of people maybe don't understand that, but that's very different. Now, if you're in one of these states that doesn't allow it, and I should say actually, Florida allows a version of this called a ladybird deed. That it used to be Texas only allowed that. That's sort of a variation of this. But if you're in one of these states that doesn't allow a transfer on death deed, then look, if you got a married couple, they can own it jointly with right of survivorship, and so the will doesn't control at that point because it just goes to whoever the survivor is. But if you're not married, you want to leave it to your kids, then it essentially needs to go through the will. Otherwise, it'll go through the intestacy process. Yes, you could put your kids on the deed, but that's a really bad idea because if you put your kids on the deed with you, then one of your kids is going to, get divorced, or they're going to run over somebody in their car and get sued, and you're going to lose your house, or at least part of it, right? So you don't actually want to do that as a way just to avoid probate. You actually have to go through using a will or a trust document. So I'm suggesting that's part of what's taking place here. And not only have we seen this with the transfer on death deeds, but we've seen it where more and more accounts, stock market accounts, IRA, mutual fund accounts, 401ks. Those are all allowing TOD designations. In fact, in many states, even automobiles, you can add a TOD on those as well. And so this non-probate transfers revolution is, if nothing else, it's been happening at the same time that we're seeing this. And I think those things are connected. Okay, so I've shown you this is the tendency of people to have documents, either will or trust documents. But there's actually two different trends taking place here. Let me show you what I mean. This is the share of adults age 55 and above in the United States who have will documents and do not have trust documents. So I'll call these people will only. And then this is the share of people who have a funded trust, what we might normally refer to as a funded living trust. Now, these people, if you have a funded trust or a living trust or an inter vivos trust, whatever you call it, the old joke in law school, what's the difference between a living trust and an inter vivos trust? The difference is about $1,200, and doctors always get inter vivos trusts. That's funny to lawyers, probably not to anybody else. But the idea here is that if you have a funded trust, you will also have a will document. Now, ideally, that will document won't control anything, and if it does, it's just what's called a pour-over will, meaning that the will document just says everything I own goes into my trust. Now, you don't want to send things through that pour-over will, because if it goes through the pour-over will, it means it has to go through probate. It has to go through the court process in order to get into the funded trust. And so that's why we prefer to have those funded trusts with will documents, the pour-over wills that actually don't control any assets. But nevertheless, if you have a living trust, you are also going to have a will document that is a pour-over will document as part of that. But over here, these are people that say they have a will document and say they do not have a funded trust document. Now, the reason why it's important to say having a funded trust is, look, if you have a living trust document or inter vivos trust document, but you haven't put any assets into it, it actually, at that point, it is not going to avoid probate. Everything that you own that is solely titled in your name at death, it's still going to go through the will. I mean, you might have a living trust document, but if you haven't retitled things in the name of the trust, if you haven't funded the trust, then you essentially have what is equivalent to just only a will, or a will with a testamentary trust in it, because that's essentially how you're working it. A testamentary trust is a description of will of what you want done with the money that takes effect after the person dies. So again, that's why we're making the distinction between those people who have a will only and those people who have an actual funded trust, such as a funded living trust, funded inter vivos trust. And we notice what's happening here. The use of will documents without a funded trust continues to fall. The use of funded trust documents, though, we're actually getting a bit of an increase in that. So we do have two offsetting trends, but you may notice just by being able to eyeball it that the drop in the use of will documents without funded trusts is much larger than this modest increase in the use of funded trust documents. And so that's why when we combine these two, we actually are seeing dropping overall, if that makes sense. So this trend is stronger than this trend, and so overall we still have a downward trend. It also explains, though, why if we go back to these first few years, and you say, okay, it's, before it really kind of starts falling off a cliff, actually the will document usage without the funded trust was already going down, even before it sort of fell off a cliff here. It's just that we had a stronger increase in the adoption of funded trust during that period of time. And part of this may actually relate to during this period of time, we see fairly strong growth in the use of funded trusts. Back in these years, there was a much stronger motivation to get planned, and that that is we had a $600,000 exemption level before estate taxes kicked in, which means a lot more people were subject to estate taxes, and a lot more people had motivation to get estate planning done. And typically, along with the estate tax planning, you would also do probate planning, which was a motivation. But then around the year 2000, those exemptions got really bumped up, so estate taxes applied to fewer people. And now we're in 2018, where estate taxes, that's just a super, super tiny share of the population. An important share if you care about money, but if we're looking at these national demographic trends, a fairly small trend. And these are projected all the way through 2018 for these particular numbers. Now, I've been giving you relatively bad news because, as we know, if we're interested in charitable legacy gifts, people have to have a will or trust in order to have a charitable component in a will or trust, right? So if we're interested in the charitable component of a will or trust document, this is not a happy trend, right? Because they've got to have one of these in order to have a charitable component in a will or trust document. But there is actually a happy trend. And that happy trend is if we look at the tendency among those who have will or trust documents, okay? So keep in mind, these are people with a will or trust document, okay? Now, among those with a will or trust document, age 55 and above, we have this trend going on. Up, 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 right? We're seeing all of this growth in, going from 8% to over 11.5% of people age 55 and above who have documents that are including a charitable beneficiary. So we do have some good news. There are really positive trends among those who have documents. The only problem is, of course, we have the not so positive trend of fewer people having documents. So what happens if we combine this fewer people having documents with this among those who have documents, more and more and more are including charity? We actually get a flat line. So if you want to know what is the share of the U.S. population, 55 and above, that has a charitable beneficiary in their will or trust documents? Well, since 1998, certainly since 2000, that's essentially been a flat line. So you might look at this and you might say, it's been like 5.7% to 6%, say just around 6-ish, or maybe a little under 6%. Nothing's happening here. The share of the U.S. population 55 and above with a charitable beneficiary, not changing at all. Boy, this is very boring. Nothing happening here. And you'd be completely wrong, because what's happening here is two very dramatic trends, one going way up and one going way down. But they're actually almost completely offsetting. And so that's why we get a flat line here. It's not a flat line because because there's nothing happening in this. It's a flat line because we have two dramatically offsetting trends in this area. So let's now break this down a little bit more. Now we're going to look at those who have will or trust documents by the age segment. So what's taking place here? Now here, again, we're still looking at our 55 and above population, but now we're breaking them down into those that are the younger age group, 55 to 64. This middle age group, 65 to 74, and then finally this oldest age group of 75 and above. There's some interesting differences here. Notice that this oldest age group, 75 and above, this actually we're not seeing, where's that dramatic drop? We're not really seeing that dramatic drop in this oldest age population, right? Now we are seeing it in this middle age population, and we are seeing it in this younger age population. We actually do get an additional observation with this older group and this younger group because those groups were in preliminary precursor studies to the modern health and retirement studies, so they go back a bit further. So we see these differences, right? We've got this drop among the younger group, 55 to 64, drop in this mid group, 65 to 74, but kind of keeping up in this 75 and above group. You might think that, oh, well, we don't need to worry about the drop because people will eventually pick it up, but let's dive into it, and let me show you why that, in fact, may not be the case. This is what we see with the use of will only by age segment. So these are people that have a will document, but they do not have a funded living trust. And there seems to be no real difference between the age groups here. Younger age group dropping, middle age group dropping, oldest age group dropping. Okay, so everybody is less likely to use the will document as their planning document. Now the difference comes here. This is the use of funded trust by age segments, and notice what's taking place here is among this oldest population, we've got a dramatic increase in the use of funded trusts, okay? But in this youngest population, pretty modest increase. Certainly if we go the last few years, very, very relatively flat. And the same within the last few years for this middle age group, relatively flat. Whereas we have these continuing increases in funded trusts by the older group. So what that means is that when we look back at this, the will or trust by age segment, use of will documents without a trust are going down for all three groups. The only difference is for this oldest group, they're actually picking up on the trust documents as well. That is offsetting that. It's not offsetting it for the younger groups. Now, what I think is happening here, I can't prove this, so this is just speculation. But I think what's happening here is that this oldest age group, 75 and above, when they think probate avoidance, they think living trust. Because they were not familiar with, in their prime financial investment years, they were not familiar with the transfer on death designation as this primary tool. And I think it's one of the reasons why what we see here is you can see where we have this increasing trend here, and then it stops from this point on. I think what we're seeing here is now we're hitting people who are more familiar with the transfer on death designations. They've grown up with them, and I think what's happening is that whereas this older population is shifting from wills to trusts, I think this younger population, I think they might be shifting from wills to TODs, to beneficiary designation, many of them real estate TODs, that sort of thing. Now, I can't see that. It's not actually in the data, but that would fit with this idea that people do what they're used to, and this oldest age group would have been familiar with the legal system before we had this what's been called the non-probate transfers revolution. So that may be what's taking place here. So if we look at now the charitable side of things, this is the charitable beneficiary, and again, we're looking only among those with a will or a trust. Okay, so these are people who have documents. And what do we see here? Well, what we see here is kind of a mixed bag. Our older people, our oldest people, these are the people that are most likely to have will or trust documents. We're pretty flat here, right? Not a lot of change taking place. But when we look at our younger people, here younger is that 55 to 64, we've got a really positive trend of increasing the share of those people who have a charitable component in their will or trust document among those who have will or trust documents. And more recently, we're seeing this now starting to kick up in this population. Now, we'll see a bit later, there's actually a 100% explanation for why this is taking place. And so I'll give you a bit of a spoiler alert here. It's because of the differences in these age groups in childlessness. The number one most powerful factor at predicting whether somebody's going to include a charitable component in their estate plan is whether or not they are childless. There was a dramatic shift, a dramatic increase in the childlessness in this country, and that shift, that increase, this is what we're seeing here. This population, this is when that's starting to shift. This younger population, it's already starting to hit, already starting to shift. This oldest population had not at this point yet hit that demographic shift yet, and so that's why they're still flat. So a bit of a spoiler alert there on why this is happening, but in fact, this is what's taking place here. Flatness here, a lot of growth in this baby boomer group, and we see this leading edge baby boomer group starting to grow there as well. Charitable beneficiary by age segment. So again, this is among everybody. So we're not limiting it just to people who have a will or trust. This is among those by age segment. And so here what do we see? We see this oldest population more likely to have a charitable component. Around 7% of the population has that charitable component. Why are they more likely to have the charitable component? We go back here. They're not more charitable, but they actually are more likely to have planning documents, right? So if they have planning documents, among those who have planning documents, they're not more charitable than the other age groups, but they are more likely to have the planning documents than are the other age group. And that's why overall, they're going to be more likely to have a charitable estate plan, or at least a charitable will or trust, because they're more likely to have a will or trust, right? So this is where we get into the two-part nature of this question, that you might look at this and you might say, oh, this, this 55 and above population, these guys are way more charitable, than these younger people here, right? And the answer is kind of, well, actually, they're about the same charitable. It's just that they are more likely to have documents. And it doesn't matter how philanthropic you are. If you don't have estate planning documents, you don't have an estate gift to charity, right? Because if you don't have the will or trust documents, what you've got is the intestacy rules, and those don't have a charitable component in them. All right, so that's a little bit about the charitable estate planning by age. Let's now look at charitable estate planning by wealth segment. And since this is a two-part question, we first need to look at who has will or trust documents. Because if you don't have a will or trust document, then you don't have a charitable component in your will or trust document. And what we see here is that when we look at the use of will or trust documents by wealth, we see just a very clear distribution based upon wealth holding. Those that are in the top 20% of wealth holders, those folks much more likely to have a will or trust document than folks who are down here in the bottom 20% of wealth holders. Now, we kind of see some generally downward trends. Those tend to be most noticeable within this middle age group here, middle wealth group here, excuse me. But downward trends a little bit, maybe not too much in this very top group, and so that's what we're seeing here. Now let's break this down. Now, before we were looking at will or trust documents. Now let's just look at funded trust documents. Now, of course, you see a massive gap. Obviously, if you got more wealth, estate planning becomes more necessary. You have more assets going through probate, more likely that you're going to be subject to the estate tax, although that's pretty unlikely these days. So what we see is growth in the use of funded trusts, and that growth is particularly strong within this group of the top 20% of wealth holders. We're also seeing some growth in these 60 to 80%, 40 to 60%. These are percentiles, share of the population. And if we come down here to like the bottom 20% of wealth holders, bottom 40 percentile of wealth holders, not a lot of growth in trusts, which makes sense because trusts are all about protecting assets and protecting those assets from probate. If you don't have that much in the way of assets, not necessarily needed. So even though we might see some vaguely downward trends in the use of will or trust documents, actually got some very positive, very healthy trends in increasing the use of funded trusts. But here where we look at the use of will alone, that is a will without a funded trust document, we see declines, right? Declines in every group. Perhaps the declines are the strongest in this 60th to 80th percentile of wealth holders, but declines across every group. Also, the reason that I wanted to show you that funded trust, that huge gap first, was so that you would understand why these groups are all mixed together here. Why is it that if we're looking at the top 10% of wealth holders, why is it that they're no more likely to have will documents than these other folks? Well, of course, the answer is because they've shifted to the funded trust documents, and that's why these are so close together. And then again, as you get to the bottom 20% of wealth holders, the bottom fifth of wealth holders here, less likely to have a will document. And of course, they are very unlikely to have a trust document here. All right, so that's having documents. Now let's look again. We're looking at those who have a will or trust document, and we want to know who has a charitable beneficiary among those who have the documents. And what we see here is not a big surprise. The top 20% of wealth holders, those folks are much more likely to have a charitable beneficiary. Modestly kind of an increasing trend here. And then the next segment of wealth holders, a bit more likely. Doesn't seem to be much difference between the bottom 20 percentile and the next 20 percentile, from 20 to 40 percentile of wealth holders. As you can see, these folks are overlapping in a number of years. So whether you're bottom 20% or bottom 40% seems not to make a big difference if you have a will or trust document on the likelihood that you're going to actually include a charitable component. In fact, this 20 to 40% actually crosses the line with the next segment, 40 to 60 percentile of wealth holders in one of the years. But this top 20% is always much higher. So if we put that together, if we just say, okay, among those age 55 and above, what's the likelihood that they're going to have a charitable beneficiary in a will or trust document? And now we get this more clean distribution here. Notice this was messier, but this was among those who have documents. But if we also take into account now this very clean division of the actual use of documents, that explains why we have a much more clean separation here between these different wealth categories. It is the combination of less likely to have documents and a bit less likely to have a charitable component as well. And so when we combine those things, we get a pretty clean separation where the top 20% of wealth holders if you're age 55 and above, you're in the top 20% of wealth holders. Round to 13% likelihood that you've got a charitable component in an estate plan. If you're in the bottom 20% of wealth holders, around let's call it a 1.7% chance that you've, maybe 1.8% chance that you've got a charitable estate plan. So that's a pretty big difference, about 1.8% compared to about 13%. 14%, pretty big difference. But a lot of that is just due to the difference in having documents. Okay, so let's next look at household types. So here what we're going to do is we're comparing three different household types. We're going to compare the married households with single female and single male. Now, one of the reasons we split it this way is because when people are answering the question, their households tend to have the same estate plan. And so if you married couples tend to have mirror image will documents. And so it's very difficult to identify gender effects when you've got married households. Because the married households, both the male and female, are going to have typically the same estate planning documents. They typically will have mirror image planning documents. And so we can't really identify the gender effects very well until we get into the single households. And now we can say, oh, clearly, this is a female household, this is a male household. Okay, so once again, we got to look at who has documents, because if they don't have documents, they don't have a charitable component in those documents. And who has documents? Married couples, much more likely to have documents than single households. And among single households, these single females are more likely to have documents than single male households for those age 55 and above. So now the other thing we see here is, of course, just as we saw with the population as a whole, declining use of having will or trust documents. And that seems to be pretty consistent. It seems to be pretty consistently declining, whether it's married households, single female households, single male households, declining across all of these groups. So not a big difference there. Let's now dive down into the types of estate planning documents. Again, this is the use of will alone without a funded trust, and pretty similar results here. Declining for all three groups. Still married households most likely, single female households second most likely, and single male households third most likely to have a estate planning document. Now, we do start to see a little bit of difference in the use of funded trusts. Now, we know that overall there's increase in the use of funded trusts, but this does appear to depend somewhat on household type. We have fairly steady increase in the use of funded trust by married couples. Also, reasonably steady, although maybe it's flattened out a bit, use of funded trust by single female households. But we don't have that increase in funded trust in the single male households. So this is perhaps one of the reasons why, if we go back to the single male households, maybe they're actually having a bit more of a steeper decline here because their drop in the use of wills is not being offset by any increases in the use of funded trust documents. Okay, now let's switch to the charitable results. And again, just as before, we're looking among those who have will or trust documents, who is including a charitable beneficiary. And what do we see here? We see actually that these lines are pretty mixed. Now notice, look, this single male, notice how this line bounces a lot. That's actually more just a consequence of a statistical reality. We're only looking at population age 55 and above. There's actually not that many single male households here. Why is that? Well, it's because most people are married and the women tend to outlive the men. Because the wives tend to outlive the husbands, that means that the married households tend to go through a transition from being married to being single female. But they don't transition from married to single male as often. So what that means is we actually have fewer of these observations. It is also the case that single male households, these guys tend to die, okay? So your longevity isn't very long if you're male and unmarried. So we actually just don't have that many single male households in this age 55 and above population. And so the reason that this line is bouncing a lot is it's just a fewer number of observations. If you get more and more observations, your lines tend to be smoother. They don't bounce as much. If you get fewer observations, then you get more bounciness here. So that's the nature of why this line tends to be bouncier. It's just fewer observations cause it to be bouncier. But that being said, there's not a lot of difference here. I mean, look, these things tend to really intertwine. Then, we'll get these weird years where we get the bounciness from the single male households, but then we get this next year where they're back down in here. Again, this is going to have a higher standard error, so we expect that bounciness. Long story short, this is obviously a generally upward trend, but we're actually not seeing substantial differences here among those who have will or trust documents in those who include a charitable component. But now if we look at who has a charitable beneficiary, not just, those among those who have estate planning documents, but who has estate planning documents with a charitable beneficiary in general, we do see married households substantially more likely to have that charitable beneficiary, in large part because they're just substantially more likely to have a charitable, to have estate planning documents in general. I don't know this. You notice here this was the financial crisis. Was this drop related to the financial crisis and the recovery? Are single male households over age 55 more responsive to a drop in their wealth? I don't know. I don't know if that's what's happening there. Obviously, those things did correspond, but that would be a little premature to say. All right, so now let's switch to education level. So once again, we want to start with who has planning documents before we jump into who has a charitable component in those planning documents. And when we're looking at who has planning documents, we see that there's a relatively clean division that between those with higher education and those who have will or trust documents. So those who have a graduate education, there is top line, more likely to have estate planning documents. Now, of course, it's still going down. Those who are college grads, again, more likely, but it's still going down. Not much of a difference between whether you have a little bit of college or no college, as long as you're a high school grad. And then here, folks that never graduated from high school, big difference there. Less likely to have these planning documents. So then let's now shift to use of funded trust. And we do get, again, a fairly clean division. Those who have grad school, graduate education, they are, and this would include lawyers, physicians, those who have masters in anything. We're combining all of those folks. PhD, everybody here. Whether it's professional or graduate schools combined here. So those folks are most likely to have a funded trust, modestly increasing here. Next most likely, those who have college. And then finally, those who have some college, those who are high school grads with no college, so we do see a bit more of a gap here. And then finally, those with less than a high school education. So even though we do see a division by education, it is the case that even among those who never graduated from high school, we're still seeing kind of a modest increase in the use of funded trusts. Now, as we go to the use of will documents only, without a funded trust, appears not to matter what education group you're in terms of the trajectory. It's down, 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 down. Every education group less likely to use those will documents without a funded trust to have those documents over the years. Now let's get to the charitable component. Again, we are only looking at those who have will or trust documents now. And what do we see? We see a pretty clean distribution. Charitable beneficiary among those who have will or trust documents, where the more education a person has, the more likely they are to include charity within their estate planning documents. And so a fairly clean distribution taking place there. And then if we shift to the last question, which is just looking at what's the propensity to have a charitable will or trust in general by education level. We now get this clean distribution, and as compared to the last one, it is, if anything, a wider distribution. Now, of course, the last one we're seeing higher percentages. We're close to 20% in some years here, whereas we're more like 14-ish% here. But we're still seeing this wider distribution because this is combining the propensity to include charity with the propensity to have the estate planning documents. Let's now shift to the most important factor. That most important factor is childlessness. So here we're looking at the tendency to have a will or trust document for the different groups based upon whether they have no offspring at all, if they have children only, or if they also have grandchildren. So in this, what we see is generally downward trends. Not a huge separation between the groups. Generally those who have grandchildren, a bit more likely to have estate planning documents. Part of that, this group's probably on average a bit older, and we do see estate planning documents, as you saw earlier. Those estate planning documents were more common at the older ages, but not a huge separation here based upon this. Let's now dive down and look at the use of will only, that is wills without a funded trust. And here we see even less separation. Pretty much all of these groups are pretty similar, maybe a bit of separation that's happened just recently. Trends are downward. Trends are similar for all three of these groups. And then we look at the use of funded trusts based upon family offspring, generally going up. For most of these groups, this is a general upward trend. Again, those with grandchildren, more likely to have them. Again, this may have to do in part with this group being on average older than the children only or no offspring group, even though everybody's age 55 or above. And so we saw that with the age association before. Okay, let's get into the charitable side of things. Charitable recipient among those with a will or trust. We're starting to see a really big difference here. Okay, and we're going to take a little bit more time to dive into this. If we've got somebody with grandchildren, okay, who has a will or trust document, what's the likelihood they're going to include charity in that? Call it 7.5%-ish, something like that. Depends on the year. 6 to 7.5% maybe. If they have children only, but no grandchildren, now we're talking about, maybe depending on the year here, 11-12%, somewhere along that. If they have no offspring, now we are looking at over 35%. So notice the magnitude of this difference. That here we're talking 7.5%. Here we're talking over 35%. So, this is about a 5-fold difference in the propensity to include a charitable recipient among those who have documents. So this is a really massive difference in terms of its magnitude here. So it's definitely worth paying attention to. So if we combine that and we look at charitable recipient by family offspring, what we see here is those with no offspring, just person age 55 and above walking around. What's the likelihood that they have a charitable will or trust document? If they have no offspring, we're talking about a 17% maybe likelihood. If they have grandkids, we're talking about maybe a 4% likelihood. So essentially what we see is that this difference, this propensity to include charity among those who have planning documents is so massive, it offsets this or this, where maybe those, certainly those with no offspring have a little bit less likelihood of having the documents, but because this gap is so huge, it completely overrides that difference in documentation level. Now I want to dive into this a little bit deeper because there's another division here that I think is important. So here what we get is I'm actually doing an extra division for you. So I want to break down the no offspring between married and unmarried. And so here I want to show you that difference. And this is the same item if they have the likelihood of just generally having a charitable component for the population as a whole in these categories. And notice that if they're married with no offspring, over a quarter of those people have a will or trust with a charitable component, as opposed to, again, those with grandchildren, only about 4%. So 4% versus about 26%. We're getting a six-fold magnitude there, maybe a bit more. Now, it's a bit less for those who have no offspring and they're unmarried. It may be that these married couples with no children, if either one of them is charitable, they're putting in a charitable component. But then if one of them dies, if the one who died was the charitable one, maybe that charitable component goes out. Just a story there. We're not 100% sure why that difference is. But also look at this. This is, again, what we've seen before, where we're looking at among those with a will or trust. And if we limit it to just those with a will or trust document, now we see some pretty remarkable results where, again, if people have no offspring and they're married, we're talking close to half. In some years it's over half, close to half of people who are married with no offspring who have will or trust documents, close to half are including a charity in their documents. You're comparing this with, maybe 7.5% of those with grandchildren compared to nearly half. I mean, this is a really big difference. So it's definitely worth noting that this is such a massive, massive indicator of charitable propensity. Now, again, if we look at use of will or trust documents, we actually have decreasing in all categories. But the married folks are, of course, the red line here. Married folks are more likely than the unmarried folks to have those will or trust documents. And now let's shift to looking at use of will or trust by giving and volunteering. So here we have the divisions are this. We have people who indicate that they volunteer regularly. And we're not differentiating between those who volunteer lots of hours or very few. It's just if they volunteer regularly. Those that donate. Now, in the health and retirement study, in order to be a donor, you have to be giving at least $500 a year combined to all charities. So the initial question is whether or not in the last 12 months or in the last in the last 12 months, if you've given to more than $500 to charities. And if your answer is no, they don't ask more details about, well, how much did you give? They just list you as a non-donor. So keep in mind, donor here means at least $500. Then we've got folks who are both volunteers and donors, and those who are neither volunteers nor donors. And so is there a relationship between their tendency to volunteer, give, and actually having will or trust documents? And notice here, that this isn't anything charitable. This is just, do you have documents? People who both give and volunteer up here, they are the most likely to have will or trust documents. People who are donors, next most likely. People who are volunteers but not donors, next most likely. And those who neither volunteer nor donate, the least likely. We do see relatively downward trends in all of these groups. We're particularly concerned, of course, about downward trends in these donor or volunteer groups because we expect them to be more charitable if they actually got their planning done, right? So let's dive into what types of planning takes place. Again, with the funded trusts, we do see a modestly increasing trends in the use of funded trusts. We see that those funded trusts are more common among people who are both volunteers and donors, and pretty close to the same if they are just donors but they don't volunteer. And then we see a lower use among those who don't donate, but they either volunteer or maybe they don't do either. Relatively lower use of the trust documents in that case. So we look at the use of will documents alone. Again, no real difference in the trajectories of these groups, down, 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 and the same division where those who are both giving and volunteering, most likely to have the will documents. Those who donate only, second most likely. Those who volunteer only, third most likely. And the least likely are those who neither donate nor volunteer. Now let's get into the charitable stuff that we're most interested in. And once again, we're looking only among those who have a will or trust document. And what we see is a pretty natural division here. A couple of things to notice. If people are both giving and volunteering, they've got about an 18% chance that if they have will or trust documents, that they're going to include charity in those will or trust documents. Okay, if they either give or volunteer, it's around in that 9% range. If they neither give nor volunteer, we've got about 4% who are including a gift to charity. So not a surprise, people who give today are more likely to include a gift to charity. People who give and volunteer are even more likely to include a gift to charity. But, for me, it's interesting to say, well, look, if you're a donor, these are donors only, you got a little over an 8% chance of giving. If you're a non-donor, you still got about a 4% chance of including charity. So in many cases, the real barrier is getting people planned. That they if they're not giving on an annual basis, that doesn't mean that they're not going to include charity in an estate plan. We'll see this a lot more as we look at the psychology of decision making, but the estate planning decision making framework is dramatically different than your normal day-to-day decision-making framework. So it's actually not a surprise that we see very different behavior taking place here, where not being a donor only makes you about half as likely to include a charity in your estate plan. Because, if we talk about current giving, then these people are 0% and these people are 100%, right? Because these are donors and these are non-donors. But that 0%, 100% difference in donor versus non-donor, it's only about an 8% versus a 4% likelihood of including a charitable component in the estate plan. So these are very different decisions, very different decision-making framework, and worth noting there. Yes, there is a correlation. Current donors more likely to include charity in their plan, but not much more likely, right? If they're just donors or just volunteers, only about twice as likely as those, maybe just a bit more than twice as likely as those who neither give nor volunteer. So some interesting results on that connection there. So now let's go to just general charitable likelihood that a person is going to have a charitable estate plan, a charitable will or trust, and we get maybe a bigger gap here because we've gotten a higher propensity to have documents among this group. So, those who are both volunteers and donors, they are both more likely to include charity in their documents, and they are more likely to have documents, right? If we look at those who are neither volunteers nor donors, they are both less likely to include charity in their documents, and they're less likely to have documents. So that's why ultimately for the super connected people, both donors and volunteers, about 12% of the 55 and above population meeting that criteria has a charitable will or trust document, whereas among those who do neither of those things, less than 2%. So we are seeing the sixfold effect here, but a lot of that has to do with people just not getting planned, right? Just getting planned is oftentimes the real barrier for folks. So that's a little bit of the descriptive statistics on what's taking place, the trends that are taking place year over year in estate planning, and in particular in charitable estate planning.